Me Too is going to be the topic today. It's been the topic of the first two episodes, and that's somewhat surprising in a way. It's not, because this permeates almost every aspect of life, as well as every aspect of the law. We talked about it in the family law context, the criminal law context, and of course the employment law context. But one of the things I want to talk about actually flows directly from what Ed and I just spoke about 2 minutes ago, which is this loss of presumption of innocence. And what happens if you are falsely accused and eventually you are exonerated? But where do you go from there? You often can't get your life back. You often can't get your job back, your marriage back, your reputation back. And this is one of the things that really troubles me about what has happened over the last half a year. We've seen a monumental change. We have gone from a situation where throughout modern history, sexual harassment in the workplace has existed, but was largely ignored, was tolerated, and those who complained were often either disbelieved, hushed up, or essentially, discarded by the organization. And it was very clear that the perpetrator was going to be protected by the employer, especially when the perpetrator was either the star or the rainmaker or the owner of the company. However, this has changed dramatically in the last couple of years, where organizations, at the hint of a scandal, are quickly basically discarding individuals. And we've seen this in Hollywood, high-profile CEOs, politicians, at least in Ontario. And my concern is that employers are going to take the lead from what we're seeing in the media, and as soon as they hear the word sexual harassment, they're going to fire the individual like that, without investigating, without giving them a chance to defend themselves. And if it turns out that there was a false allegation, they're not going to have any way at all to basically get their lives back. What's interesting to me is if you look at this historically, for decades, first of all, behavior that we would now consider to be completely inappropriate was essentially appropriate within the workplace. Look at shows like Mad Men, and they're not that far off from what we used to see in office space. And then even behavior that we knew then was unacceptable was still tolerated, and victims were threatened or forced out. And essentially, organizations looked at this as a cost of doing business. They would essentially say, we're not going to deal with it. We're not going to get rid of our star. He or she, well, usually he, is bringing in all the money. And if there's a complaint made, we'll deal with the fallout then. And I've written about this for years, saying, first of all, that we need to treat sexual harassment seriously, but also that employers are not going to take it seriously until it becomes more than a cost of doing business. They need to be willing to take action. The Gomeshi scandal, which Ed and I talked about earlier, is a perfect example. You had literally a media star, and it was obviously a well-known secret that he would engage in sexual harassment. And as the report, which is conducted by a colleague of mine, Janice Rubin, as the report revealed, it was known, but it was never addressed, and he was allowed to continue harassing. He was essentially protected. And when the story came out, everyone was horrified, and they were aghast that the CBC would have let this happen. What was interesting to me is that when I would speak with people privately or in groups, almost everybody had their own story of the person in their organization who was known to be a harasser, who everyone knew. You never put the young female interns alone with so-and-so, and yet every organization allowed this to continue. The one positive thing that came out of the Gomeshi scandal was that sexual harassment in the workplace became a real topic of discussion. And also, people became aware that they didn't have to tolerate being harassed, and employers became aware that they could not tolerate harassment in the workplace. We started to see, as I mentioned earlier, a lot more complaints of harassment being made. Unfortunately, the criminal trial had a bit of an effect of discouraging people from complaining, and it's unfortunate because that was really not exemplary of what will happen in a typical workplace investigation. But what is interesting is that when the Weinstein scandal broke in the fall, and we had the Me Too movement start and Time's Up, etc., everything changed overnight. And now you didn't have organizations protecting the accused. You had organizations basically discarding the accused as quickly as they possibly could. And we now have a very popular hashtag, Believe the Victims, which I think is a great sentiment. And I want to be very clear. I've said this in writing. I'll say it now. I think it's great that employers and society as a whole are taking sexual harassment in the workplace seriously, and the perpetrators are being penalized. The problem with Believe the Victims is that what we're really talking about is believe the complainant. when we first hear of an allegation of harassment, we have two parties. We don't have a victim and a harasser. We have a complainant and an accused. And until you have evidence of the fact that there was harassment, you're dealing with someone who may be wrongfully accused. And I know that's not common. I know most allegations have some legitimate basis, but I will tell you from personal experience, I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen even before Weinstein, even before Ghomeshi. I saw a situation where 3 women working in a department had a male boss. The male boss retired. They all assumed that one of them would become the supervisor. And they were all extremely upset when an outsider was brought in to supervise them, a male outsider, I should say. And what happened? I got involved when they, as a collective whole, the 3 of them went to HR and said, our new supervisor is sexually harassing us, and gave examples of what he had done, touching, threats, etc. And my client wanted to fire the guy on the spot. And I said, no, you have to investigate. And this is one of the things that our firm does all the time. I don't care whether you're talking about harassment, theft, absenteeism, any kind of misconduct you suspect. I've written a book. It's called You're Fired. It's all about just cause for dismissal in Canada. And one of the prevailing themes is you never take action. You never discipline. You never fire someone without investigating so that you're satisfied that there is good reason. And what I often tell employers are usually reluctant. They don't want to incur the cost. They don't want to waste the time. They just want to move and send a strong message that we do not tolerate such conduct. And what I always tell the employers is you need to investigate. One, because you need to be sure there was misconduct. Sometimes there wasn't. Sometimes it's a misunderstanding. Sometimes it's a false allegation. But also, if you investigate, part of that investigation has to include confronting the accused, giving them a chance to give their side of the story. And they may clarify what happened and help themselves. More often than not, though, they're actually going to help you as an employer, because what they will do is lie and try to cover up what they did. And now they've compounded their errors. They not only engaged in misconduct, they've demonstrated that they are dishonest and untrustworthy. And if you as an employer are going to go before a judge and say, we had just cause to fire this person, your case is going to be a lot stronger if you say, not only did they do X, Y, and Z, whatever the case may be, they were dishonest. We can't trust them. We cannot continue to employ them. And your case is going to be a lot stronger. But bringing this back to the sexual harassment Me Too movement, it's critical that someone who is accused of sexual harassment is given the chance to respond, given the chance to clear their name. Hopefully, I mean, we always see the ones that make the media. And at that point, it's usually too late to contain it. When we're talking about the average employer, the average employee, you want to contain this as much as you possibly can, maintain confidentiality as much as you possibly can, because if it turns out there was no harassment, you want to allow this person to resume as close to a normal life as they possibly can, as opposed to having had their career, their marriage, and their reputation decimated. So what I would like to say in closing is that the Me Too movement, in my view, is great. And I'm really happy that finally sexual harassment is not just seen as a cost of doing business. People are aware that harassment should not be tolerated, cannot be tolerated. But from an employer point of view, do not follow what you're seeing in the media and immediately dispose of someone who is accused of sexual harassment. Take the time, investigate properly, fairly, give the person the chance to respond, and then you make your decision. And I know it sounds self-serving, work with an employment lawyer. We can guide you through the process, whether you're investigating internally or externally. We can make sure it's done properly and also give you advice on how you should deal with it, depending upon the findings. And ultimately, you as the employer, and especially if you're in HR, you're the one who's going to be cross-examined if this goes to court. And you're going to have to justify the decisions that were made and the actions that were taken. So it's critical you do things properly. It's also the right thing to do to keep both sides and treat them both fairly. Please also remember, and I suspect Ed will agree with me, none of this replaces legal advice. If you suspect that you might need an employment lawyer, you probably do. Feel free to reach out to us. We'll be happy to talk to you, let you know if we can help. And if we can, that's great. If we can't, there's no harm done. But please don't try to avoid the legal costs by doing it yourself. That's all for today. Thanks for tuning in, and have a nice day.